Good evening, good afternoon, or good morning, depending on where you are. My name is Steve Sang. I am the director of the SOAS China Institute. Welcome to this webinar. I'm delighted to introduce to you Emily Feng, who is going to be speaking on a very important subject. Emily is an award-winning American journalist who covers Greater China and with a special interest in the human rights situations there. She is the international correspondent for NPR, and before that, she was the Beijing correspondent for the Financial Times. She was educated at Duke University in the United States. I mentioned that she was an award-winning journalist, and the awards she have won that I am aware of includes the Human Rights Press Award of 2021, the Sorensen Journalism Award in 2022, and the Daniel Schroed Journalism Prize in 2023. She is author of a very interesting book, Let Only Red Flowers Bloom, which came out earlier this year. This presentation she's going to make will be based on her findings in the book. Over to you, Emily.
Professor Tang, thank you for that very generous introduction, and thank you everyone for joining today, most of whom I understand are joining in their evening, so I'm very flattered and appreciative. Findings, I think, is a bit of a strong word. My background is journalism, so I'm here to present stories, and a lot of the stories are extremely experiential. So rather than having a prescriptive conclusion at the end of the book, I think the volume is more a volume of observations and informed by my own experiences as a reporter on the ground for about 7, almost 8 years in mainland China mostly. And I thought I'd first start a bit about why I wrote this book, what inspired me to write the book, and then go through some of the stories that illustrate what I mean by identity when I talk about identity in this book, and why I think it's important for understanding Chinese politics today. This fuzzy, often very, very nebulous concept about how people see themselves and how they're seen by others, and why I found that to be a central facet in so many of the stories I was doing on Chinese policy and politics. So first, a little bit about why I decided to write this book. And I write about this. I'm assuming most people have not read the book, so I apologize if I am repeating things that you've already read. But in the prologue of the book, I talk about thinking about how to report on China one day if I was unable to actually physically be in mainland China. And many of you who follow the journalism world understand that it's become very difficult for British outlets as well to get resident journalist visas for foreign correspondents to live and work in China long term. There is, after the coronavirus pandemic ended, an increase in the number of short-term visas, so going for a specific conference or to cover one topic in particular for 3-4 weeks at a time. But it's become very, very difficult and very slow, even if people do manage to get them to get journalist visas to live in China for years at a time. I felt very lucky that I had such a visa for several years, including during the coronavirus pandemic. But it was starting to become clear to me, even by 2020, that the trends on the ground politically under Xi Jinping were going to make it very difficult to renew that visa. And I had to be mentally and professionally prepared to continue covering China in the event that one day I couldn't actually get a J1 visa, as we call these visas, to be in China. Eventually, that did happen. I was forced to move to Taiwan at the end of 2022. Forced, of course, is a bit of a strong word because Taiwan is such a lovely place to live, but it was a change in setting, and it created a whole set of challenges on how to report on China outside of China. But the genesis for this book was about what stories do I think are important, that are increasingly global, not confined by the boundaries of the PRC itself, and that the story that I felt stood out to me was identity. And when I think back to the stories that stay with me over my years, particularly with NPR, reporting in mainland China, every story that drew me in was somehow about the history of people's identities, the incredible natural diversity, politically speaking, ethnically, linguistically, culturally, geographically, that you find in the country, and letting that diversity shine through as a strength for the country, and unfortunately also as a target for many of the national security, economic, and cultural policies that have come out over the last 11 years, more than 11 years now, under Xi Jinping, who is now head of the party. So that's how the idea for the book began. And although it's very much rooted in the headlines that you might read about China, about its economy, about its elite politics, the book itself is a work of narrative nonfiction. So it looks through the eyes of about 13 characters who I profile and through their life experiences and showing rather than telling through statistics or through news bulletin items, but going through their perspective to inform people just how it feels to live through some of the big changes with regards to the theme of identity in China over the last decade. Why do I think that people should care about identity? Increasingly, especially in American politics, there's been a backlash against speaking through the perspective of identity politics and to understand greater social phenomena across the country, across the world, through the perspective of a particular identity group. I think, however, understanding identities in China and how state leaders understand identity has become increasingly important to understanding China's foreign policy and certainly domestic policy with regards to ethnic minority policy and national security policy. And because Professor Tsang has done such great work on Hong Kong politics and history as well, including during the handover period, when I was covering the 2019 anti-extradition protests in Hong Kong, identity was such a central theme. Identity, whether it meant political and economic values, or values when it came to civil liberties. They were so central to formulating the anti-extradition movement's identity, its political aims as well. And that has become about a fourth of the book to begin with. In the book, I talk about how the state increasingly controls expressions of identity, and particularly who gets to be considered Chinese. Um, and this preoccupation with identity began as soon as I moved to China. I noticed that there were more and more state media, state propaganda posters about the 12 core socialist values, which only continue to this day. And I wanted to understand how the head of the Communist Party, Xi Jinping, has concerned himself not just with ideas about Chinese rejuvenation and making China resilient technologically and economically from the rest of the world, particularly the US, but how this project of rejuvenation is also very much drawn from an understanding of what is Chinese identity. Unfortunately, this idea of Chinese identity has become more and more exclusionary. It doesn't draw on, say, the 55 other ethnic minority groups that are existent in China outside of the Han ethnic majority. And it's an identity that's increasingly privileged Mandarin Chinese at the expense of other Chinese languages, to other political identities, certainly political visions for what China should be and how it could be developed as China chases down this goal of economic resiliency and also prioritizes national security and its economic policy. And also, it's an identity that's increasingly put the party state at the center of what it means to be a good Chinese citizen. When I first moved to China, I had a wonderfully illuminating conversation. I'm just thinking about it now, actually, with a great analyst of Chinese politics named Zhu Blanchet. And we were talking about whether or not in 2015, the average Chinese citizen, if you asked them about the Chinese government and their interactions, their engagement with government on a local and a national level, whether people would understand the difference between interacting with the party apparatus and with the government apparatus. And at the time, back in 2015, the party was not very visible. And so we were discussing about how most people actually were still having more of their interactions with the government side of things. And they might not be able to differentiate between party activity and government activity, which overlap quite a bit. I think now, particularly during the coronavirus pandemic until now, the party apparatus has become once again so much more dominant, so much more visible, and they increasingly set the direction for what local and national government do. Um, uh, Another reason why I thought that I would write about identity is the Chinese state increasingly sees itself and its citizens as um, uh, influential in the world. And I think that there's been this reliance more and more rhetorically to things like the Chinese dream or a Chinese version, a Chinese way of doing things, of developing economically, of creating a cyberspace that isn't necessarily open and free, but putting out its own version of how it sees cyberspace to be governed, and also a unique economic model that's combined both Chinese market controls and also elements of the free market and capitalism that China has been trying to also promote as just as competitive um, to other economic models. So how do I translate that into individual stories? How can different people, just 13 or 14 people, tell this story? Um, I'll go through an overview now of some of the people that I chose to profile in this book. And if you do choose to read it, I think I hope that these stories you find moving. I begin the book with characters who emphasize different economic and political visions for the country. And geographically, the book begins on the eastern seaboard of mainland China, where most of its population live. Then the book moves on to the historical borderlands of the Qing Empire, the regions of Xinjiang and Inner Mongolia, and the provinces of Ningxia and Gansu, which are today part of the PRC, and how the characters there emphasize more of these themes of cultural and ethnic diversity and identity in China. And the last third of the book, I ended up writing in Taiwan. At that point, I had moved to Taiwan, and that physical move where I was also shaped the writing of the book. And so the last third of the story talks um, about Hong Kong, about Taiwan, and then finally, the book ends with the Chinese diaspora in the US. So not even in the Asia region anymore, but emphasizing how this conversation about Chinese identity and its influence is a global story now, and not one confined to the Asia Pacific. So to go back in time, starting with the Eastern Seaboard. One of my favorite characters in this book is this woman named Yang Bin, who begins as a state prosecutor in the Chinese court system. And she is a product of China's opening and reform. Her parents had lived and worked their entire life in one state-owned factory compound. She grew up thinking she would do the same thing, but because of opening and reform, she was able to choose her career, and she chose to work for the state court system, helping the state prosecute criminals. And she helps build essentially China's rule of law system. She's extremely excited when China proves itself ready to join the World Trade Organization as well. And she strongly believes that having a consistent and fair rule of laws governing both criminal behavior, but also international business and civil matters is really, really important for creating a stronger China. She considers herself a patriot. And the reason why I considered her emblematic of Chinese identity, I've taken a very, very expansive view of what identity can concern itself with. But the reason why I think she emphasized and is emblematic of a facet of Chinese identity is that she sees China's law system as an extension of what the Chinese people can be capable of. She becomes a Christian. She converts halfway during in her 40s, and she also believes that the rule of law can be humane. That a legal system, as China develops economically, can also reflect the evolution of Chinese people's ethics as well. And she becomes very, very famous, actually, for one case in which she pleads leniency on behalf of a Chinese migrant worker who murders her two young children because of the economic poverty that she finds herself in and the inability to tap into social welfare systems that might have made that raising those children more easy. Now, Yang Bin is arguing on behalf of the state. She's prosecuting this Chinese migrant woman, but she argues for a much lighter sentence for this woman. And after one appeal, she actually ends up getting this woman released early from prison. And instead of tanking her career, this is in the early 2000s, this case of the migrant woman elevates Yang Bin as a state prosecutor to national fame. She's celebrated as someone who exemplifies the best of China's rule of law system. But instead of promoting her, she's demoted in her job. And eventually she decides to quit her job and join the other side of the aisle, so to speak. And she becomes a human rights lawyer. So whereas before she was suing people on behalf of the state, she is now a lawyer outside of the system suing the state. And I won't spoil the end of the chapter, but she finds herself completely on the other side of the law, actually, um, by the end of her career. And that personal arc spoke to me so much about how the Chinese court system and its legal system and the hopes for this legal system have changed so much. When I first moved to China, it was about the end of the Weiquan movement, this rights defense movement for mostly constitutional law scholars in China who strongly believed and had a lot of influence and impact in using existing civil laws and China's constitution to advance the rights of different groups of people, whether it was women or land petitioners or climate campaigners. And they had real impact. And Yang Bin, I thought, was at the vanguard of this. But unfortunately, the way that that movement has been disbanded pretty much, and their story echoes throughout the many of these human rights leaders then kind of reappear at different points in the book. Their story, I thought, emphasized so well how many different legal ideas for what a Chinese legal system could be have developed, and unfortunately, some have been quashed. So that's one aspect of identity I talk about in this book. Another story that was very central to this book was the story of a chapter I call The Believer. So a man whose Arabic name is Yusuf. Now, Yusuf is also a Chinese patriot. He's a Hui Muslim, born in uh, born in Shanxi province in China. And he doesn't grow up religious whatsoever. But he also was born at the same time Yang Bin is, around opening and right before opening reform. He's a teenager around this time. And he has kind of a come to God moment at the funeral of his grandfather, who had been an observant Muslim. And it's right after his grandfather's death that he discovers his religion, he discovers God, and he makes it his life mission to understand how Islam, in his view, is an incredibly Chinese religion. And so he spends the rest of his life writing, somewhat controversially among the Muslim community in China, that Islam is drawn from Taoist philosophies, Confucian philosophies, and most controversially, this is not in the book, but most controversially, he puts up the point that he believes Confucius was actually a Muslim prophet as well, and how his ideas are central to Islam. He also um, finally goes abroad in his late 20s to do the Hajj, to make the pilgrimage to Mecca in Saudi Arabia today. And he discovers while traveling that he feels incredibly Chinese. In fact, he meets all these other Chinese pilgrims who, through that Chinese community, make his pilgrimage possible. You know, he doesn't have money at this point. He's basically housed and fed for free by other Chinese pilgrims. And he realizes that in China, with this distinction of Hui Muslims being an ethnic group and not a religious group, that there's somehow this divide between him and other Han non-Muslims. And so he tries to also bring down those barriers and to change people's thinking of being a Muslim as an ethnic categorization and more as a belief group that anyone can join if they decide to convert to become religious. So you can see how already maybe why his ideas might be a little bit sensitive and dangerous in today's China. He's basically arguing for the power of proselytization, which had not existed before because religious groups, in particular the Hui Muslim group, is seen as an ethnic group, one that you're born into, not one that you can become. And unfortunately, he also finds himself swept up in this detention campaign that begins in a totally different region, in Xinjiang. And he begins to understand how ethnicity, religion, and cultural policy are all tied up, even if he's not living in Xinjiang, even if he's not Uyghur, just simply because he's living and working in this Muslim world that exists in Western China. And with him and with Yang Bin, they were never in NPR stories that I did. They were peripheral. I apologize, I seem to have cut off there. None of these characters were main characters in NPR news stories that I did, but I stayed in contact with these voices. They were people that I interviewed as secondary or as reference characters to confirm other items in news stories. But their personal stories stuck with me so long that I ended up interviewing them over the course of years, and they ended up becoming main characters in this book. And then finally, I think I'll end on a story about Hong Kong and about how different ideas of what Chinese values should be and different visions how different now Chinese territories should develop have created such conflict and angst within the People's Republic of China. With Hong Kong, it was one of the few threads through this book that overfilled more than just one chapter. So I have one character named Kenny, who's a Hong Kong protester, who ends up kind of reappearing in three different chapters in this book. And I think it's because many of the themes and aspects of identity are all interconnected. And I found in the reporting process as well, I would meet someone like Kenny, for example, or a former Hong Kong bookseller in one setting, and then I would move to Taiwan, and they would show up again. I would somehow end up running into them or running into their story once again. And when I moved to the U.S., the same characters would reappear. They'd be active on issues that I was still covering and that were suddenly news again, which I think just shows how global the story of Chinese identity is. But the story of Kenny is one of a
Yeah.
Hong Kong frontline protester. He had been born right before handover to his mother, who's a mainland Chinese economic migrant to Hong Kong. And so he grew up feeling incredibly Chinese and very proud of being Chinese, and remembers celebrating the rise of China when Beijing won the 2008 Olympic bid. He felt like this was the time for China to rise, and that they could also learn from Hong Kong and its enormous economic development as a way to strengthen the mainland. Unfortunately, during the 2019 protests, he finds himself more and more involved. He, despite coming from a very impoverished family in Hong Kong, had had an excellent public school education and excellent civics teachers, and he feels like it's his duty as a Hong Konger to participate and falls in with this group of core frontline protesters who are organizing themselves on Telegram to go every night onto the front lines. Eventually, he is arrested, as many people in his group, but instead of showing up to his court hearing, he decides to become a fugitive. And I follow him as he decides, in hiding, to not stay a fugitive, but to try to escape Hong Kong. And he is one of a small group of people who gets on a small fishing boat and tries to sail to Taiwan, where at that point I had already moved and had been following the story of other asylum seekers from Hong Kong, from mainland China, who were trying to find asylum, trying to get residence in Hong Kong. They had heard that Hong Kong was a paragon of democracy, that they believed Hong Kong could be a home for um, Chinese speaking dissidents in the Chinese speaking world. And unfortunately, they encounter a lot of issues there. Issues that, to be fair to Hong Kong, I think have been enormous challenges for a tiny, tiny place as China becomes incredibly hostile to it. And so the story becomes not just a story about the Hong Kong protests, but how Taiwan gets wrapped up in that. And I'm sure, as many of you know, the reason why the amendment to the anti-extradition law was proposed was because of a thorny legal case that involved a murder that happens in Taiwan. Um, and Taiwan, of course, has its own complicated issues with Chinese identity and political relations with China, and I talk about that in the book. And then finally, I mean, plot spoiler, Kenny is not able to seek asylum in Taiwan, and he moves to the U.S., which is where I finally meet him, and where the story ends with other Chinese diaspora that have decided to make the U.S. their home for better or worse. So through all these different stories through from China's biggest cities to its borderlands to finally Hong Kong and then outside of China to Taiwan to the US, and there's some tangential stories in Europe. I tried to get to this idea of Chinese identity. All these people begin as believers in the Chinese project. They, in their own ways, whether as businessmen, as lawyers, um, as activists, as writers, as academics, as teachers, they all in some way want to make China a better place. But their vision of who gets to be included in that Chinese project, what a better China would look like, inevitably puts them somehow in conflict with the Chinese state. And pressure is piled on them, and the pressure becomes bigger and bigger. And so they're either forced to give up their project altogether, or in many cases of my characters, as I found now that I've written the book, they've left mainland China. They've left China altogether. Um, I myself in writing this book also left China, and I think that it's become increasingly difficult to write and to report on China. I've thought about how this book could be different if I'd finished writing this book in Beijing. Would I have gotten better stories? Would I have gotten more color and more detail? And I'm not sure I would have. It had already become incredibly difficult to do in-depth on-the-ground reporting by mid-2022, which is when I left the country. And it became very, very difficult to spend enough time with a person to really get to know them and to be able to write a profile that communicated the depth of who this person was or what a place was like to a reader or to a listener. My attempt with this book was to get people to feel exactly what it was like to live through some of these big political changes in China and Hong Kong and Taiwan and that impact around the world. And not just to read a news story about the facts of the matter as it was happening. I think that we're blessed to have wonderful writing and documentary films and podcasts and cultural products that are coming out from other parts of the non-English speaking world. I've, for example, seen incredible documentaries about the war in Ukraine, about Russians that are impacted by this, by Ukrainians, but I sense a lack of that kind of cultural product, that kind of reporting and empathy, therefore, for Chinese speaking subjects. Um, and so my attempt with the book was to get people to really empathize with these characters, even if you've never traveled to China or to Taiwan, and to see them as humans and to find parallels in their experiences with maybe political events and changes that are happening in your own life. Um, and with that, I'd love to hear questions and comments from the audience. And I apologize if the talk was kind of scattered, but I think the point is that identity is incredibly expansive in China and that it's always changing and that people are still having these conversations, albeit maybe outside of China more and more, but that there's a very, very robust diaspora conversation about what it means to be Chinese that I find myself heartened to participate in, even though I'm no longer in mainland China myself.
Well, thank you very much, Emily. You have been extremely generous in allowing for a lot of time for discussions and conversations. Now, before I opened it to the floor, or indeed before I kick off with a questions to start the conversation, let me remind all of you who are attending this webinar that you should use the Q&A box to put your questions or your comments to Emily. It would be helpful to me if you could indicate who you are so I have a sense of whether you are a student or whether you are from some place where you do not normally have access to China studies expertise. I'll try to prioritize people from that background. But if you would like to stay anonymous, please say so at the start of it. I will not read out any information that will enable others to identify who you are, but it is always helpful for me to know that background. Please don't use the chat box, just use the Q&A box for that purpose. Let me now move on to the discussions, Emily. Your wonderful book has important people who reveals, and you have written in very vivid way about their experience and what changed them and how they change. All wonderful. But I wanted to press you a bit there in terms of the generalizations of it. How much do those life stories tell us about how people in China more generally feel about this identity project? Because I think you, in your opening presentations, in fact, effectively, not quite in such words openly, but implicitly make it very clear that the identity project in China is tied to the China dream of national rejuvenation, that the identity is being shaped and formed by the leadership in China, and people are being encouraged, supported, and indeed recruited to support and embrace this sense of identity. You have characters who start off buying into the system who then drop off. You have people who perhaps were not quite so necessarily fully buy into it either from the beginning. But how much does your research, does this book tell us about how much buy-in do your, in quotation marks, the average Chinese citizen have of the Chinese government or the Communist Party's identity project in China as a whole?
That's a great question. The book is not a survey, so it's not meant to say, do most people support this or don't? But it's to highlight people who I thought were representative of different communities and identity groups in China who have been impacted in unexpected ways and who have been left to the margins because of this more homogenous idea of what being Chinese should be, what that should look like these days. I would venture to say they're probably, if you add them up, a minority of Chinese citizens numerically, but they're not an insignificant minority. I would argue they're also a very, very influential minority. I think that the voices of Hong Kongers, of people who have different religions and of different language backgrounds, even if they're a minority, still deserve to be heard. And the other audience I was thinking about, the other group I was thinking about ultimately was who would read this book. What were the stories that would get them to understand on an emotional level, would allow them to pierce the distance and the unfamiliarity with a place perhaps that is very, very different from the place where they're reading the book, would allow them to cross that distance and understand the inner world of someone whose life experiences thread through so many of the economic and political stories that we read about or hear about in the news, but in a very, very fleeting way. So that was what informed me when I chose these people. It's not meant to be a scientific representative sample of the average Chinese citizen, but I do think that even if they're a minority of people, that they represent a conversation and a reality of how these policies feel on the ground in China.
Okay, we got the first questions from the audience, and I would encourage others to put forth your questions or comments. It's nice to have the questions being prefaced by a very positive statement, but if you would like to be more critical, you are very welcome to do so too.
Absolutely. And also, I'll add if people want to ask questions more about the nuts and bolts of the reporting process, particularly if you yourself are interested in journalism or have already jumped into the ocean there and are studying journalism, I welcome those stories, questions as well, even if they're not book specific.
Excellent. Now, the first questions come from Adrian Farina, who is at the King's College in London, reading a PhD. He paid compliments to your brilliant talk and how much he looked forward to reading the book. The question being put is that he often read that for the Communist Party, the idea of social stability is a critical component to enable economic growth. Is it a more diverse patchwork of identities in such a large and diverse population possible while still achieving that stability?
I obviously believe in diversity, so yes. But I think that there is this natural fear among communist leaders about allowing identity to be decentered and to be spread too thinly among different ethnic or identity groups. And in the beginning of my book, I specifically cite this leaked speech that Chairman Xi Jinping makes early on during his appointment as head of the party, where he cites the example of the Soviet Union. I think this anecdote and the speech has been now repeated many, many times in different analyses of Chinese politics. But in this speech, Xi Jinping speaks to why does he believe the Soviet Union collapsed and how can the Chinese Communist Party avoid that? At this point, the party has lasted longer than the Soviet Union has. And so I think it's probably vindicated some of the top Chinese leader's belief, but he believes that the Soviet Union fractured among too many different economic and political interests. Part of that, of course, was the way that the Soviet Union understood its ethnic groups. China had explicitly copied the Soviet Union's ethnic policies to allow cultural autonomy, even if they didn't have political autonomy, between some of the biggest ethnic groups that comprised the PRC at the beginning of the founding of the country. And in my book, I talk about how there is an actual reorganization of the Communist Party bodies that oversee ethnic and religious groups to make the model switch away from that Soviet model, one that had seen kind of a diverse umbrella of different groups, all united under the political identity of the PRC, but how the Chinese government and the Communist Party shifts away from that, starting about 10 years ago, to one that embraces a mischaracterization of American melting pot theory. So their understanding of American melting pot theory is that all of these people with different backgrounds come together in one country and they're melted down into soup, one soup that's flavored American or Chinese. Now I say this is a misunderstanding because melting pot theory in the US is now understand more as everyone has their primary identity of sharing American values and being American, but that in public and private settings, you still are simultaneously able to retain a different identity. You can be Chinese American like me, you might be Hispanic American, you may speak a different language in public and with family back home, or practice a different religion from your fellow Americans. But at the end of the day, you're still American. So this is why I call it a misunderstanding of American melting pot theory. But that there's, based on this misunderstanding, an actual reorganization of the Communist Party's United Front bodies that oversee ethnic and religious policy. Um, but in that reorganization, I think it comes back to Xi Jinping's speech, which begins the first part of my book, which is there is an explicit connection between not so much economic development and diversity, but a connection between social stability, which you mentioned, and the fear that diversity undermines social stability. There could be a world I can imagine where a technocrat might be able to balance the different diverse groups and interests in China and still create a civilization, a society that lives in harmony. But I think that's much more difficult. And the solution that ensures a higher probability of social stability is to make people more alike to one another. And I think that's unfortunately what you've seen leaders in China do. But there is, I think, an explicit anxiety about diversity somehow being harder to govern. I do think that there is a link between diversity in China and its economic prosperity. And although I don't argue this specifically in the book, many of the characters initially actually become quite wealthy. So Yang Bin, I mean, she's not wealthy herself, but she helps many Chinese entrepreneurs and businesses go out and develop. And she also, because she is in Guangdong province, she is seeing many Hong Kong and Taiwanese entrepreneurs in the 80s and 90s come to mainland China and set up their factories there and develop. One of the chapters in this book profiles a private entrepreneur, and many of the people who are around him in that milieu in the 90s and early 2000s specifically, and the environment in which they're operating and creating these multi-billion-dollar businesses in China, but eventually how they are targeted as well because of their economic influence. So and also like the Hui Muslims. I mean, one very fascinating element of that community that I found that's not in this book, but drew me to their community was they were often, and they still are, the liaisons, the intermediaries, and the translators for much of the Arabic language, business, and trade that happens between China and the Middle East, parts of Africa, and Southeast Asia. Because of their backgrounds, they often study Arabic, Persian, and it makes them very talented multilinguists who can learn other languages very quickly. So they've ended up becoming really valuable intermediaries trade-wise between China and the rest of the world and help China's rise as an exporting powerhouse. So I think there's actually an explicit connection between diversity and economic development that's not mentioned in this book and that leaders haven't mentioned. But I think the inverse is certainly true, that diversity is seen as a detractor to social stability within China these days.
Okay, we've got quite a few more questions, including a few anonymous ones. I'll pick the first amongst those. And this is on the point you make, Emily, about using the personal narrative to generate empathy. The question is, generating empathy, so what? There's still a long gap between written narrative and actual social movements. How do you see the gap being bridged?
That is an excellent point. And someone asked me this last week as well. I had a moment during the early days of the coronavirus pandemic where I felt very, very disappointed in what I had done or failed to do. I'd spent, weeks and weeks and weeks um, working nonstop, hoping that just indirectly, by telling the stories of people who had suffered terribly during the early days of the coronavirus in China, that the rest of the world would feel sufficiently warned about what this virus could do. And I felt like I had made no impact whatsoever. And so, personally, professionally, I have completely delinked the purpose of my work, why it sustains me and gives me meaning, to achieving any kind of social impact. This is not to say that it isn't important to me, and that I hope in everything that you do, that I do, that it has some kind of beneficial social impact. But I think that if I tied what keeps me in journalism, what keeps me going and motivated, to the kind of social impact that it has, I might have quit long ago. And perhaps these things work in strange ways, butterfly effect, something happens this year, and long term, society somehow becomes better 30, 40 years into the future. And I haven't seen the impacts just yet. But the way the world works sometimes is things happen so indirectly and in such complicated ways, and there are secondary and tertiary effects that I never anticipated, that I no longer think explicitly about what kind of impact that I want to have because I'll find myself frequently disappointed. Um, but I do believe that empathy is one of those things that even if there's secondary and tertiary impacts, I cannot predict. Ultimately, in the grand scheme of the universe, it is a thing that we need more of and is better. I just can't say in the ways it will be better. But I think that if people understand that these are people just like them living on the other side of the world, and that the impacts of the votes that we make and the policies that we formulate in our countries also have an impact on people over there, that will be for the better somehow. And even though, I was not treated the best in China, I still loved reporting there, and I always encourage people to go and study and travel and even work if possible, have experiences, whether even if it's just as a tourist in China, because it's such a big country with so much diversity. The things that you hear about in the news don't necessarily play out in the ways that even Chinese leaders hope for on the ground. So it's always worth going and seeing things for yourself and meeting people there. Um, yeah.
Okay. We got quite a few more questions. And the next one I pick is from Professor Gerda Weilander. And there are in fact two questions, and it's a bit complicated.
Okay, Gerda, I believe I've interviewed you. Go on.
Okay. The first question is that considering the sensitive nature of your individual narratives, how did you consider the ethical implications of your research, including matter of consent? How do you go about this? The second question is quite different, but she said it's quite similar to the question I put to you about the representativeness of identities represented in the book. From the three examples that you have outlined in the talk, they are clearly not typical in terms of Chinese people. Could you say a bit more about the other cases? Do you also have examples of people who have not left or who cannot otherwise be labeled as, in quotation marks, dissidents in some way? And if they are all in this category, to what extent does the book fit into the Western assumptions that Western assumptions about China, and therefore the book mostly caters to Western or American assumptions about China? In other words, does the book tell us about China, or does the book tell us about what Americans think about China?
Let's start with the first because it's the easiest. As in all the reporting that I do, you have to have a conversation with a person about what parts of their stories they want published, anything they don't want published, whether they even want to be an interview subject to begin with. It's impossible to get to know someone without first having their consent, their buy-in on such a project. In some cases, I've not used their real names. That was sometimes for storytelling effect, but mostly it was because they did feel like it was not in their interest to have their public identity tied to the level of detail they wanted published in the stories. And there were two characters that I very, very, very much wanted in the book, but unfortunately, it was not possible and not safe. I should say not safe to tell their story to the level of detail that I felt would make a reader care about their story. So they're not in the book in any shape or form. But it is this constant negotiation of what do you think would be the best story and what is the story that is possible to tell given the safety and security considerations of the person who is at the center of the story. And you end up something that I hopefully that you feel proud of, that I feel proud of, but it may not be everything you know that you want to tell in the story. As to your second question about representation, I don't think, with the exception of maybe one of the chapters about the Hong Kong bookseller, that any of these people would consider themselves. Oh, and also maybe there's one chapter about a Chinese student who tries to become a dissident to very, very little success. With the exception of those two people, that none of these people would actually be considered dissidents in China. They would have been considered, they considered themselves just ordinary people who were trying to do things that they cared about, or to start businesses, or do the things that they thought the state actually prioritized. And in that process, over time, began to be considered dissidents as the political winds changed. As to how representative these people are, again, it's not a scientific collection of people. I was choosing stories that I felt illuminated the aspects that I found most interesting about my time reporting in China, that I felt weren't explored in mainstream media, including in my own news stories about China, usually for lack of space, um, and an inability to go into the kind of detail that a book could afford. So this is also why I wanted to do a longer form project about China, so that if people so chose to read the book, that they would get a sense of China that went beyond just the news items and the facts, not the facts, but the kind of headline grabbing items that you read about in the news. And as to whether I think this caters to Western assumptions about China, I think people know so little about China in the West that there's actually not even that many assumptions beyond China is big and China is bad. And what I wanted to break in terms of those very, very shallow and very few assumptions about China is that China is big in the sense that it's homogenous, because it's not. The point is that it's incredibly diverse and that policies on the ground are implemented in very, very different ways. And the people who are affected by them are very, very different as well. And that it's bad. These are people who, again, do not see themselves as dissidents, do not begin the book thinking that their government is bad in any way, and actually want to help China to become stronger in some way, but find those results stymied. So I don't think that they're representative of, I think, the mainstream. But my point is that it's very, very difficult to even generalize what a mainstream community in China would look like, given its inherent political and ethnic diversity. That's what I wanted to get across. And perhaps I could say through empathy and through understanding that China is not big and it's not bad, that might um, be counter to Western assumptions. But I didn't write this book thinking that I was trying to disprove any kind of Western framework or assumptions in that way. I did think that my goal was, however, to give Chinese voices a more personal and detailed amount of space than they're usually afforded in culture and in media.
Thank you. Next question is quite specific. How long did it take for you to convince the sources to go on the record and be included in the book project? Somebody would like to stay anonymous.
It entirely varied. So, for example, there's a chapter about a Uyghur family in the book who live in Turkey now. And they had lived in China for many years, moved back and forth between Turkey and China, and unfortunately had their children separated from them without their permission for a period of almost 2 years. I knew about their case in early 2020, 2021, I want to say, but it took almost a year and a half before they were ready to tell their story. And it took, a check-in every month, every 2 months to see how their case was progressing and how their family was doing before they decided they were ready to tell their story. There were other people who I got in contact with them and had an initial phone call, and pretty much immediately they said, "Great, of course. What else do you want to know? What more material can I send you?" So it really, really depended on the person, and I couldn't find any kind of pattern about why a person would be more quick and more willing to share their story to a very, very intimate degree. Um, I still don't know, to be honest. Oh, Stephen, are you there? And I still don't know, but I think that's kind of the magic of being a journalist is sometimes you don't know. People share their stories and you can't figure out why, but they're incredibly generous with them. Um, but in short, there was a huge variety, and some people, um, I don't try to persuade people. They have to decide that they're ready themselves and that it suits their interests. But some people, it took a while. Hi, Raphael. So I noticed that Steve has dropped out, I think.
Yeah,
Uh,
he must have disconnected, but if you want, I can read out one of the other questions.
that'd be great. I think we have about five. I can
Okay.
stay on a little longer if we want to finish the questions.
All right, absolutely. 1 second. Okay, so this is a question from Emily, who's a SOAS alumni. How did the Chinese identity, uh, understood by the residents in China? Yeah, I think to mean like, how is the Chinese identity understood by the residents in China itself? And are there disparities across different provinces or cities? And if so, how did the differences bring effects to the Beijing governments?
That is a very, very big question. Um, I mean, the point that I make in the book is that diversity and identity can take many, many different forms, whether it's a political identity or a more explicit cultural or ethnic identity. I think that many people consider themselves Chinese first and foremost, but Chinese is such a loaded term and it has real meaning and real substance, but it's also such a constructed term. And I wanted to dive into what inputs go into constructing that term for different people and how has that changed over time. And I think that the state has and the party have become more interested in identity, and I tried to make that clear through these individual stories without talking so much explicitly about the policies themselves because that's a little dry and I cover that normally in the news. I'm sorry that's not a super very it's not a very super it's not a very direct answer, but you've kind of gotten at the heart of the book is how do people see themselves and how do Chinese leaders why would they care about that identity?
Um, I do apologize. Somehow my connections got dropped, and then I have to reconnect, so I would have missed part of your responses. Um, I don't know whether you actually move on to the next question.
Yes,
Um,
Raphael asked one of the next questions from Emily, and I answered, and I think we're ready to take one more.
okay, and the one that I pick now is from Michael Mo, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Newcastle. In fact, two questions from Michael. First question. It seems that the identity building project by Beijing has lost its magic after the COVID restrictions and the current economic woes. Chinese students in the UK and the US are seemingly less expressive of their national identity, though they remained impressive in cultural identity. Do you see if the magic is gone or if the pride has already peaked? The second question is, consequently, what are the factors that make young Taiwanese now attracted to the contemporary culture projected by the PRC propaganda?
On the first issue, I don't know if it's peaked. I think that I don't think the magic has disappeared. I think that if we wanted to use the lens of identity to understand Chinese sentiments today, I think that given the increase, or should we say the maintenance of the level of effort that the US government has put out to contain and compete with China, that's created a very convenient foil to create Chinese pride and to center, if we want to talk about, again, the questions of identity, though I don't think it's talked about in these terms so much, but if we wanted to understand Chinese identity from a technological and economic perspective, that contrast, that foil the US is able to present has actually strengthened Chinese identity in some way. And it's a very compelling narrative because I think it's true that increasingly China's development and its rise are is explicitly seen as a source of competition and an existential threat to the US and vice versa. So I don't think the magic is gone, but I do think that the center of how people think about identity and where that might come up in Chinese economics and politics has changed when I was in China from one that was very much still about more abstract concepts of rejuvenation, of social stability, of this idea of national security, to one that's explicitly economic and explicitly technological um, in its language. And then remind me of the second question, Professor Tsang.
The second question is about what are the factors that make young Taiwanese attracted to the contemporary culture being projected by the PRC?
Yeah, I wouldn't go as far to call it PRC propaganda. I think this is very much, most of it, organic cultural production being done under, the very, very censored and controlled circumstances that exist in mainland China, but that there's so much of it and that it's being disseminated on platforms, think TikTok, YouTube, even though that's blocked in China, that are by nature global because they're internet based, that the sheer volume of it presents it as a viable option alongside, say, South Korean cultural products, Taiwan's own Japanese cultural products within Taiwan. And of course, they share a common language. And so it makes it very, very accessible for young people in Taiwan who are looking to connect to global cultural conversations and platforms beyond just the tiny, boundaries of Taiwan itself. So I think because there's truly interesting cultural products and short videos and television series and novels that are coming out of China, just like in any other Asian country. That is one of the cultural competitors for young Taiwanese today. But I still see, Korean and Japanese cultural products being just as compelling and just as influential in Taiwan as Chinese ones. It's just that the newest entrance is for sure the PRC.
Okay. Next question, also from somebody who would like to stay anonymous. And the question is about how do people in China see Chinese identity and whether there are discrepancies across different provinces or cities. And if there were, how would that affect Beijing's governance?
So I think that was the question that Raphael asked while you were gone.
Right.
I apologize.
Okay, sorry. Yes, then let's move on. And this question comes from somebody who has come from the PLC, who deeply cares about Hong Kong and are very much thinking about the effects of the fire in Taipo. The question is, how do you think this incident might shape Hong Kong people's sense of identity moving forward? And could it potentially widen the divide between Hong Kong and mainland China?
I think you might be able to answer that question better than me. I'm not in Hong Kong these days. I don't have a family connection in Hong Kong, so I don't feel qualified to speak to that. And I hope we still don't know enough, I think, about the specific causes of the fire and how the investigation will be handled. So I think until then, I don't want to speculate about the after effects of the of the terrible fire, but it is a news story that we've been following I was actually writing something about just before this.
Okay, I will take you up on that and share one or two thoughts before we
Please.
move on. The thing we have to bear in mind is that a lot of the really big questions about the fire have not been even raised at the moment. And it is very likely that some of those issues will be raised as time moves on. The government in Hong Kong has very much focused on getting people distracted. And therefore, very quickly, you have people being arrested, you have theories being floated before the investigations really have been advanced far enough for the authorities to know what the origins of the fire was. But what we do note is that we are talking about 7 large tower blocks ablaze in a city of tower blocks, where similar over 30-story high residential blocks was commonplace. And we know the fire brigade could not reach beyond the first few floors. We know that in all 7 buildings, the fire alarms did not work. And it would appear that the built-in firefighting equipment did not work or did not work well enough to save enough life in the matter. So there will be questions about whether the problems that happened at these 7 tower blocks were problems specific to these 7 blocks, or is it going to be problems associated with all the development projects by the housing associations which build these blocks? Or does it apply to the wider public sector housing, or indeed to the entire residential market in Hong Kong? And that will show that there are problems with the building code and the fire code, and how the government deals with them is going to have a very major impact on how people in Hong Kong look at the government and asking the questions of whether the government in Hong Kong behave the way it is behaving, putting in quotation mark national security first, because it's a bunch of people who choose to do so, or they're doing so because of the instructions or pressure from Beijing. Now, when that question is being asked, and if that question is allowed to be asked, then you are going to have potential implications on how people in Hong Kong feel about the much more central issue of identity and relationship between Hong Kong and the mainland of China. Anything more for you to add to that, Emily, or before we move on?
No, that's absolutely fascinating.
Next question, also anonymous. You mentioned that China is a hugely diverse country. To me, it is a bit like describing a jungle as diverse, and China, therefore, is one such enormous jungle. Should we approach and research China, its government, and its people just as we study a jungle and its wildlife?
How does this question asker conceptualize a jungle? Is this
That it is, I think the idea was that is also China is so diverse and everything is different. And therefore, in a place like that, the diversity results in a kind of law of the jungle. And therefore, is that the ways to look at how we should understand China, or we should understand China in a completely different way? I mean, this is not being written in the question box, but the implication will be that if this is not the right way to look at it, what would be the right way to look at it?
I don't see it as a jungle in the sense that it's chaotic and there are no patterns or frames of analysis that we can use to understand China, but merely that I think the ways we understand China and I hope how Chinese leaders understand and empathize with their own people are probably more need to be more encompassing, more expansive, more heterogeneous than they currently are. But no, it is not a law of the jungle, nor is it absolute chaos.
Right. There's one other question which you kind of partly addressed, but let me read you the questions anyway. What did you find about the impact of the new minority or nationalities policy on identity? It's a policy that aims to get members of the minorities to identify as primarily Chinese, or as at least as members of the Zhonghua Minzhu, and only secondarily as their particular ethnic minority group. Do you find that it is as yet succeeding in this objective?
I think that yes, absolutely, ethnic policy is being designed so people primarily and identify first with being Chinese in the way that the Chinese state has defined. Of course, I think that these different expressions of cultural linguistic identity are part of a Chinese identity, but one that doesn't have to be so restrictive and homogenizing. But yes, that policy wants people to act and speak primarily in a Han, Mandarin, Chinese speaking context. And whether this is working, I had an interesting comment that someone made in the reporting I did on Inner Mongolia. There's a Mongolian character here in this book, and his accidental journey into language politics as an IT programmer, and how he gets caught up in all of that when Chinese education policymakers try to have rewritten the public school textbooks in Inner Mongolia. And one of the characters, not the main character, but one of the characters in this chapter that I write said to me, it's inevitable that we all become Chinese in the way that the state wants to make us Chinese. We're a tiny minority, they're the majority, and inevitably this is where the historical trends lie. And I think he's probably right. I mean, populations change, countries change, everything, nothing is permanent in this world. But in terms of what people can hold on to for as long as they can, yes, in some way, I think it is working. And I think particularly with language, this is not to say that I don't think that people should all learn to speak a common language, and they should learn that at school. That's what you need to build a country, and for people to be given a chance to compete economically in a national economy as well. So that's not what I'm saying, but I do think it's important that people be given the resources and the space to also keep their mother tongue, their family languages. And I think on the language aspect, China has been succeeding completely. And not just with non-Mandarin related languages like Mongolian or Uyghur, Tibetan, but also with other completely Mandarin related languages and dialects. For example, the group of Wu dialects that my parents speak as their first tongue. None of my cousins who are my age have raised their children, my nephews and nieces, with that dialect, even though it's their mother tongue. And so in one generation, I've seen that completely disappear within my own family.
Next question, another anonymous question. How do collectivism and individualism shape Chinese identity in Xi Jinping's narrative and propaganda?
Excuse me, say that one more time.
How does the narratives of collectivism and individualism shape Chinese identity in Xi Jinping's narratives and propaganda?
I see that they're absent. There isn't much individualism, with the exception of holding up select individuals as representative martyrs or revolutionary examples for people to follow.
Right. Another question. As a journalist who was once based in China, are you optimistic about being able to go back to China and work as a journalist? And how's the news environment out there right now? Could you share a bit of your thoughts or your knowledge on that, please?
Mm. Am I optimistic about going back myself and working as a journalist? I think long term, yes. I think in the near term, no. And one of the projects that I'm working on currently, my next book actually, so hopefully I'll have something to share by the end of next year with everyone, is unfortunately going to be not conducive to, I think, working in China in the near term. But long term, absolutely. I think that, again, the world works in ways that you can't predict. And I do hope that China becomes more open to free press and to journalism in the future. The news environment over in China, one of the chapters in this book that I didn't talk about yet in this talk is specifically about the plethora of information and online censorship in China. And the character who tells that story is a man who I nicknamed the scooter thief, who goes viral and has to deal with the consequences of this newfound fame. He's not prepared for it whatsoever. And in that chapter, I talk about how there's actually an incredible abundance of information sources in China. We hear about the censorship and the surveillance, but that doesn't mean that there is a sterile news environment or a complete lack of cultural production in China. In fact, there's a lot, but the general contours of that, the decision architecture in which all of that stuff can be made, of course, is still kept monitored very closely and contoured by the state. So I am incredibly impressed, that is to say, with people who work in Chinese journalistic outfits, who are trying to make artistic projects and products in China, and often write really wonderful stuff and make things that I really love watching and reading here in the US still. But I'm not optimistic about the general trend of journalism over there. I think it's become incredibly difficult, especially for Chinese journalists at Chinese outlets, to do the work that they do. There are just fewer and fewer long form pieces that I'm reading these days from China. This was certainly true even when I was based there. And I think for non-Chinese journalists, the foreign press corps working for foreign news organizations, for whether it be Japanese, British, American, Canadian, what have you, that the space they have and the resources they have to do reporting have shrunk considerably since the beginning of the COVID pandemic. With some exceptions, I think the Japanese, the Germans, most European outlets, the number of journalists that foreign news organizations can afford and are given visas to keep on the ground in China has shrunk. And increasingly, I'm reading, I think that news appetite for news items coming out of China has also dipped slightly, in part because American politics has taken up the bulk of foreign news coverage, or in my case, domestic news coverage that our news shows and news outlets are devoting to. So I'm not seeing as many in-depth treatments of topics and people in China these days.
Can I follow up on that
Please.
question on something a bit more specific? I mean, you have written a fantastic book with specific cases. You do not feel that, or do you feel that any of the parts of the book you have written might have, from the perspective of the Chinese state, cross a line for them that might make you not quite so welcome as a journalist in China? Where would you see that lines to be?
In the book itself?
Well, in the book, or if you think the book has not crossed any line, where would you see it as crossing the line?
So I never really understood exactly why I was not allowed to go back to China. And I've heard different responses in private from different Chinese officials. So I actually don't have an idea about what specifically crossed any line and where the lines are. And that's the issue with doing business in China, with working or reporting on China, is you're not really sure what will anger who and what those effects might be. I honestly do not know. I do think that A lot of the Xinjiang reporting that I and other reporters did was not something that they were happy with, but I can't say for certain whether that in my coverage or in this book crossed a red line that would then prevent me from returning to China.
Okay, that's helpful to know, because we know, for example, John Sudworth of the BBC, after his reporting in the minorities areas in Xinjiang, they make it impossible for him to stay on to perform his duties as a journalist in China. There's a question, another anonymous one. Have any of the individuals you have written face any reactions from the Chinese authorities? And how have you shared your stories and the book about your sources with them? I think it's with your original sources, your informants. Since the questioner would assume that most of them would not read English anyway.
I would say about half of them do, actually. But the other half, I've just told them kind of how the book has gone and sent them a copy. It is coming out in Chinese very soon. So I'm hoping that I can follow up with some of them who don't read English very, very well and send them the traditional Chinese version of it when it comes out. But that's kind of how it's gone. Most of them, even if they don't speak, even if they don't speak English, can kind of skim through the book and generally understand. But I'm waiting for the Taiwanese version to come out. And I shouldn't advertise this widely, but there is a pirated Chinese language version of the book already floating out there. So that's also in extreme circumstances something that I have shared with people if the physical book or the English book is just not an option for them. But no, as far as I know, there hasn't been any backlash because of the book against these people.
Okay. I think that's all the questions I have in the Q&A box. And if anyone have a urgent questions to ask, this is the moment for you to do so before I draw this webinar to a close.
There is also, my email is public, my signal is public. If people have a burning question that occurs to them at 3 a.m., they can message me afterwards and I'll see if I can get back to them.
Well, that's very kind of you, very generous. At least the saving grace is that with the time difference, 3 a.m. our time may not be quite 3 a.m. in Washington.
Oh, I can't promise that I'll answer immediately either. But please do try.
But it's a very generous offer. With that, let me thank Emily Feng for this fantastic talk, and also for your participations and your questions and your engagement. I too apologize that I disappear from the screen for a couple of minutes. I have no idea what happened, but somehow the internet connection seems to have been cut off for a few minutes. I would look forward to seeing some of you either in our in-person events or on one more of our webinars. Thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you all. Good night.